The category is What the Trans Darling.
Hello, and welcome to What the Trans.
What the trans? I have no idea what I'm doing with these intros.
Neither do I. I just tinker with my voice and make it sound like I'm someone who lives under a bridge, and that seems to work.
Yeah. It's always good. Got to pull in those trolls. No. So how are you?
I'm all right. I'm tired because there was a lot of things that we're going to get into in a bit.
Indeed, we
and
are.
Also, I went to a protest that was fun. I actually spoke at it, and you'll be hearing what I said later on, person listening to this.
You go, Michelle.
And this week I have mostly been watching from afar the horrors that is the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is... I mean, I use some hyperbole sometimes, is what I do.
Yes, indeed.
When you are doing this kind of thing, you are creating content in the online space. You do tend to use words that are quite hyperbolic to get people's attention. This is not the case when I say the Nationality and Borders Bill is an absolute disaster for everyone, everywhere, ever, and needs to be killed immediately. And it's made me very angry about that. I will include some links about what that is for people who don't know. And for the people who do know, you probably know because it probably affects you in some way. And for that, I'm sorry. The UK sucks and it's horrible. But yes, I've been reading about that and it's made me very, very ticked off. And if you want to get ticked off too, you can read all about that in the description below. How are you doing, Ashley?
Yeah, I'm all right. Obviously, I've been following along with Creeping Horror a number of news-related developments, some of which we're very absolutely about to talk about. But yeah, I'm okay. You know, I posted something on Twitter recently, which actually for me is is quite new, and I recognise that for nearly everybody that's not a remarkable thing to mention. So, still adapting to my new circumstances mentioned last week. And thanks to everybody who got in touch, by the way, to say, hey, heard the episode, that sucks, thoughts are with you, etc. Thank you, everybody, because that does actually help. It's like, I have, friends, I have support of some sort. So that was nice. What else? I really haven't done anything interesting, I'm afraid. So
well, we're both about to do something interesting tomorrow at time of recording.
We certainly are, yes.
This will have happened by the time this goes out.
Yes, indeed. And let's hope nothing really newsworthy happens in the meantime. Otherwise, this is going to seem incredibly dated and aged like milk. Anyway, yes, so there is, tomorrow at time of recording, there is a protest in Manchester with reference to the government's plans on conversion therapy, which it may surprise you to learn content surrounding which takes up a fair chunk of this episode, although we do finish off with something pretty cool, something from history. But yeah, so with that said, I guess it's probably time for moving on to the first segment, which is, what's it called again? Oh, not the news.
For fuck's sake, it's always the news. Ugh. Okay, let's do some news.
Let's do it. Let's get into it.
First thing, it's not really news in the classical sense, it's just what happened at the beginning of this week at time of recording. So before we get into the news, yeah, I was working on some stuff, trying to cook some things up.
Yes, indeed.
For our audience to enjoy / be horrified by. And so I wanted to talk to some former patients of a bunch of gender critical clinicians, because I thought we are a trans news outlet, quote unquote, really pushing the boundary on the word outlet means by saying that, but that's what we are.
That word is doing a lot of heavy lifting, but yeah.
Yes, so we thought it would make sense to look into the experiences of patients of certain clinicians who work in the gender identity area, and I thought it would be especially fascinating to see what self-proclaimed gender-critical therapists and clinicians, how they treated their trans patients, because gender-critical feminism has been called a bunch of things by a lot of people. Some of those people include us.
Indeed they do. Yes,
so we thought we would try and find the truth of what seeing a gender-critical clinician was like by going to the former patients. So this isn't exactly the wildest story idea we've ever come up with.
No,
trans. It's very much on our beat.
Very much so. There's certainly been more peculiar and, other things that we've covered that I would have thought when we've been planning them, oh, this is going to result in a certain amount of flack, and that's not happened. And then this thing, which is a fairly obvious thing to do for a trans news quote-unquote outlet, and yet The response... Well, no, go right ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, strap in, everyone.
Yes.
This gets weird. So, firstly, I put out a list of names of clinicians who have identified themselves in some way as being gender critical. And one of those clinicians announced to all of his followers online that I was a trans terrorist assembling a kill list, which was news to me.
Yes, that's quite a leap, isn't it? Given that the account that this stuff is, the account you're making these requests from is quite open and specific about the fact that we are a podcast made by some trans people. And to get straight from that to terrorist, it kind of suggests a certain rigidness of thinking of the people who make those accusations.
Yeah, I was quite offended by this, but also there was a part of me that thought, okay, this is kind of funny in a way, but also this person did just tell thousands of people that I'm a trans terrorist, putting him on a kill list, and that's kind of defamation, right?
Yeah.
That's what defamation is. But moving on from that, then the weird emails started. Very, very strange emails, including one from a person who emailed claiming that they had a particularly positive experience with one of the clinicians that I had named in that list. But then I looked up their email address, and it was linked to a YouTube account of someone who just loves to comment loads of transphobic shit everywhere. So it's like, as sources go, I don't think this is one that can necessarily be trusted because, this person has a certain history of commenting a certain way. So I'm pretty sure the story they've sent me is nonsense.
Yes.
Hi, if you happen to be listening, I did send you an email back, which you never got back to. So, if you get time, I'd love to hear. I'd love to know why you sent me that load of nonsense. So, if you're out there. But there were quite a few emails like that. Got a lot of abuse. And then on Saturday, I got an email from the health editor of the Mail on Sunday. Telling me that two of the people on that list went to them accusing me of digging for dirt to discredit them. Now, the Mail on Sunday person asked me for a comment. I didn't give one. I just asked if there was going to be a story about me in the next edition of the Mail on Sunday. And they immediately said no.
Right.
And I was like, so I emailed back saying, well, why'd you ask me for a comment on a story you're not running? And they were like, well, just in case we were, we should always get a comment, as a journalist, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they were fishing. I think they were hoping that I'd say something
sure.
that would make it a story. I don't know what the hell that was. But yeah, so finally, the group, The Thoughtful Therapist, publicly accused me of looking for information to, in their words, maliciously report them. Report them to who? I have no idea. But yeah, they made this weird accusation of me whilst tagging me in with the fucking Government Equality Office and J.K. Rowling, like they were trying to dob me in or get boost on it or something. I don't know.
Yes.
So all of this got a lot of heat on What the Trans, and
yes, I spotted that.
I'm quite confused as to why the hell the response was this strong and apoplectic on their part. I believe because I asked to just speak to some former patients. What did they think I was going to find?
Yes.
Like, what if all the patients had stepped forward and said something nice?
Yeah.
What was I going to do? Like, not use that? Like, what? I think what happened is pretty obvious. They saw a trans-related thing, asking questions about them, and they immediately freak out. And either try to use that as ammo to further paint that trans people are full of shit in some way, or they were terrified of what people were going to tell me. Like, it's got to be one of those two things, right? I mean, I don't know, but just, I'm so thoroughly confused by everything.
Yes, and so when you drew my attention to this and on the social media and the messages we were getting...
That must have been a fun ride for you, just watching things get more and more bizarre.
Yeah, it very much was, because it all happened relatively quickly in terms of the escalation, I guess, particularly in terms of the escalation of rhetoric, because just straight away accusing you and, I guess, by association, me, of being a trans terrorist who is assembling a kill list, that's a hell of a thing to say.
Yeah, I was pretty clear in what I put out, being like, look, we just want to hear your stories of your experiences with these clinicians if you've had them.
Yeah.
Wasn't asking for stories of horror, wasn't asking for stories of joy, wasn't asking for stories of conversion therapy, or asking for stories of being thoroughly affirmed, or anything at all. Like, I just said, what are your experiences?
Love to hear. Let's find out. Let's actually ask some people who've, had these people as their clinicians and see what they've got to say. As you remarked earlier on, it's like, well, if they'd actually done a good job, they probably wouldn't be afraid of what those patients would say about them.
Yeah, their response is like, if somebody was asking, oh, what are your experiences at Alton Towers? And then Alton Towers ran to the press to try and do a hit piece on the person asking. If Alton Towers did that, would you think that Alton Towers was on the level?
I probably would not, no. So yes, it's been quite a week, hasn't it?
Yeah. Just of all of the things I thought that we would get shit for from these people, of all the things, I didn't expect it would be this.
Yeah, not this specific thing. I mean, I can see how and why it would have happened, but you think it would have come up. This level of vitriol would have come up by now, But oh well.
Yeah. So saying that, if you have any experiences with gender critical therapists, do get in touch.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
We're probably not going to name any more because that didn't go well. But if you have experiences with gender critical therapists, good or bad, we'd love to hear from you. So email us, contact@whatthetrans.com, or get us on any of the other things we have that you'll hear about at the end of the show.
Indeed.
But so we should probably get onto our main story in the news.
Yes, and it is a chunky one, this one, isn't it?
Yes. So I have been calling this the conversion therapy ban screw job, because that seems to describe what it is, and let's just get into it. So, over the past few weeks, there has been a lot of drama and bullshit around the proposed conversion therapy ban that we've been talking about for a while on the podcast. Here is what the hell has happened and where we are now. The government's conversion therapy ban had first been promised in 2018, when it was included in the government's LGBT action plan. Now, this action plan was, past tense, a very comprehensive list of things the government intended to do to improve the lives of LGBT people. Then it came from primarily a survey the government put out to the LGBT community that had over 100,000 responses to it. So it's very comprehensive. A lot of people had a lot of input into it, and this action plan was a very good thing. But unfortunately, it was ultimately binned by the Boris Johnson government not long after they came to power. Because of course they did. Yes, of course they did. But the government did keep 2 of its pledges and kept repeating these through Liz Truss over and over and over again. They were going to ban conversion therapy for LGBT people and to hold a global LGBT conference that everyone was so dearly asking for.
Oh yeah, and we were very much looking forward to it.
Yeah.
What an event it would have been. Ooh, spoilers there, I suppose.
Slight spoilers.
Yes.
We will get to that. So, after releasing a public consultation on the proposed ban months ago, the government did that. In late March, ITV News' Paul Brand announced that through leaks and anonymous sources, he had learned that the proposed ban on conversion therapy was going to be dropped by this government in its entirety. No ban on conversion therapy for LGBT people. This seemingly came out of nowhere and took many people by surprise. Several hours later, after a massive backlash from everyone who's ever met an LGBT person, Brand announced that he had now learned that the conversion therapy ban had been brought back from the dead. But this time, trans people would not be covered by the ban, as the government believed that after 4 years of planning, the trans conversion therapy ban needed more thought and to be slowed down.
Slowed down, yeah, that's... The one thing that everybody remarks about the trans community is that it all happens so fucking quickly.
I know, right? The way they were selling it at the time, when they were saying like, oh, well, we need more thought, we need to slow things down and make sure we get it right. And it's like, it's been 4 years.
Yeah, how long do you need, fellas?
What? Like, this is clearly bollocks. You've clearly just like, well, we'll get into why I think that they changed their mind on this. So all of this came after the Equality and Human Rights Commission had intervened earlier this year, announcing that they believe that we shouldn't rush into a trans conversion therapy ban, just in case it had unintended consequences, quote unquote. And unintended consequences seem to be the line that was used a lot by people who were very, very happy with the idea of allowing the torture of trans people to remain legal.
Indeed. And just a note on that, obviously the EHRC have been in the news off their own back because of some guidance that they released, which basically went against the Equality Act and various other bits of legislation, and there was a backlash to that. However, we wanted to talk about conversion therapy this time, but EHRC, we will get to you.
Yeah, that's going to be on the next one, I think, because oh my god, there's so much to go through in general.
There is, yeah.
Why can't
so much
people
digging.
just shut the fuck up about us for 2 minutes?
Yes.
Like, why are they so obsessed with us? I don't understand. I mean, that's a question we will never get. Actually, I've answered that question before. It's money. They make money or they profit in some way by using us. That's what that is. But anyway, that's a whole other episode in itself.
Indeed.
So the reason why this is a viciously evil decision is because for years now, gender-critical people have advocated for conversion therapy, but have been calling it something else. Now, they won't call it conversion therapy, because they don't believe that anyone can be trans. Being trans isn't a legitimate thing, so you're not really converting anyone. But they have called their version of this exploratory therapy. Now, as it has been tradition for charlatans and wankers to rename the practice of conversion therapy over the years to other things to make it sound cool, like reparative therapy, same-sex attraction therapy, and restorative therapy, this new bullshit term is a phrase used by gender-critical people to mean sitting down with a trans person and telling them being trans is the result of trauma over and over again until the person stops being trans. But the term exploratory therapy was everywhere when it was revealed that trans people would be dropped from the ban, which just shows how effective this nonsense has been. So the idea is, if they call what is conversion therapy exploratory therapy, that makes it sound like the recommended practice of affirmation doesn't explore people, doesn't have any exploration in it, like nobody asks questions ever, which I think anyone who has been through like an affirmative therapy model will know that's absolutely nonsense for sure. But, this isn't about truth. It's about selling something evil, which is what exploratory therapy does, which is actually conversion therapy. Let's call it what it is. So as a result of trans people being dropped from the ban, hundreds of organisations and groups began to pull out of the government's proposed global LGBT conference, which the government had hilariously called Safe to Be Me, which just, oh my God, so beautiful in how the branding was the exact opposite of everything they are.
I know. It's kind of like, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and stuff. Like, it's just a euphemism for something awful.
Yeah, that's what it was. But why did I use past tense just then?
Well, why did you?
Because less than a week after trans people were yanked from the ban, the government decided to bin the conference entirely as it was becoming clear that nobody was going to show up. Like, everyone pulled out. Everyone from Stonewall to the teeny tiniest little group in the middle of nowhere. Like, nobody wanted anything to do with this conference. And it wasn't exactly going well for them anyway.
Yes.
But this was very much the nail in the coffin. So, in response to his pretty little conference lying dead on the ground, the UK Special Envoy on LGBT rights, Nick Herbert, released a blog post on his website where he blamed the collapse of the conference, not entirely on the actions of the government, but on the LGBT lobby, as he called it, specifically citing Stonewall as ringleaders in the boycott, which they weren't. The boycott has been going on for a while and was coming up independently in so many groups.
Yes.
That Stonewall being the ringleaders of it is just not true. But he called this an act of self-harm by the LGBT lobby against itself for killing the conference. He failed to mention how the collapse of the conference could have been because the government were trying to look like global leaders on LGBT rights whilst doing everything they can to fuck LGBT people at every turn. I mean, you've got the government binning the LGBT action plan we mentioned at the top. You've got the government binning the LGBT advisory panel, which Jane Ozan and many, many other people were on. And they binned that because of disagreements over trans issues, apparently, according to Liz Truss.
Indeed.
You've got members of the government's Equality Office and the Equality Hub and all these other people meeting with the LGBT Alliance and other hate groups, as was revealed by Ben Hunt in Vice not that long ago.
Yes,
You've also got Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch being caught on tape being homophobic and transphobic, again reported by Ben Hunt in Vice. It also failed to mention how Liz Truss had turned on Stonewall and attempted to cut ties with the organisation across the government, seemingly because she thought it would make herself look good in the press, who were really gunning for Stonewall at that time. How the government had entirely ditched Gender Recognition Act reform 2 years ago, in September of 2020, after it being promised to trans people for about 4 years.
Hooray!
But no, it was all the LGBT lobby's fault that the conference was dead.
Yeah, absolutely. It's those damn hippies on the left!
I cannot overstate how bad the government have fucked LGBT stuff for themselves. So much. They've actively made it dangerous to be their friend because, Stonewall and the government have had okay relationships in the past. That has been a good, okay working relationships. And then the government turned on Stonewall the second it thought it could play well in the press. So it's being their friend is actively dangerous.
Yeah.
That's how, I don't see any trust being rebuilt anytime soon between anyone LGBT and the government because, after that alone, they went after Stonewall. because they thought it would benefit them. How fucked up is anybody else?
The whole Tories going viciously after the LGBT community and the human rights of minoritized groups in the UK. I mean, I'm all for a bit of 80s nostalgia, but this is just taking it way too far.
I know, right? And Nick Herbert is trying to pin this on the LGBT lobby, which he's calling us now.
Because that's a thing that exists.
Yeah, and it's like, mate, your government did this.
Yeah.
Like, your government absolutely fucked this from day one. It was never going to be a success, and this is just... To be honest, it sounds like everyone did you a favour. But yeah, so on the 10th of April, last Sunday, at time of recording, a protest was held outside Downing Street by the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition, which is a sort of like it's a coalition of loads of different LGBT groups that came together. Now, this protest was the biggest I had seen that wasn't Pride-related, as somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people showed up. Leading the protest was longtime LGBT activist and religious leader Jane Ozan, who I quickly spoke to here. Hi Jane, thanks for talking to me at the protest today. So, I think it may sound like an obvious thing to ask, but why are you here?
Well, I wanted to show solidarity with my trans friends. You know, trans people are so much more likely to go through conversion therapy and be harmed by it. And we had to send a very loud message today to Downing Street, to MPs, to Britain, really, that we have to have a ban which covers the most vulnerable. And I was thrilled to see so many people join. I had no idea that so many people would come. It's been extraordinary.
It's been emotional for me, that's for sure. So, in your experiences, do you notice any particular overlap or differences between the experiences of LGBT cis people in CT and trans people in CT?
Well, the core is completely the same, that you're forced down a one-way street and you're told that who you are is wrong, is sinful perhaps if it's in a religious setting, or it's unacceptable to your friends, your family, or your cultural group. And that, it's what we call a predetermined purpose. And cis people and trans people all suffer the same form of abuse, and that's why we need the same forms of protection. It's really quite simple. And that's why all other countries have ensured that trans people are protected alongside LGBT people.
What are your hopes for the government to maybe put trans people back in the ban, or maybe improve the ban? What are your hopes?
Well, my hopes after today are really strong. They can't keep a lid on so many people who feel so strongly. We've got MPs and lords across all political parties lobbying the Prime Minister now, saying you've made a massive mistake. We've got the medical experts saying that. We've got the international community saying it. I feel that I know that we will get the right ban in the end. It's just a question of whether the Prime Minister will do the right thing and lead.
We can only hope. Jane Ozan, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you.
I also spoke to Mariam Din and Helen Belcher from Transactual, who also gave speeches at the protest. Here's my chat with them. Helen and Mariam from Transactual, thank you for talking to me. So, why are you here?
So, the government say that LGBT people shouldn't be tortured, but trans people can be tortured. Conversion practices are abuse, that's it, full stop. And by refusing conversion practices for trans people, the UK government is literally saying that it's okay to abuse trans people. And we also know that trans people are more likely to be victims of conversion therapy than LGBT people, with the risk increasing even further for black trans people and trans people of colour. So we're here because we want to protest against that and ensuring that trans people are also included with the ban. But we're also here because we're protesting about the government's other actions, such as transphobic comments in the media, appointing a transphobic EHRC lead, and so many other things, failing to address crisis in trans-related care. There's so much going wrong here, and zooming out of trans-related issues for just a sec, we have bills targeting the Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, a total disregard for disabled people, and the amount of racism and Islamophobia that we're seeing from this government. And also, they're attacking our right to protest. So really, what we're here for is not only around conversion practices, but actually the government and the way this government is continually targeting the most marginalised and the most vulnerable people in this country.
Well, what Mariam said, basically. I mean, that's a pretty comprehensive reason.
I have a question for you, Helen. You are probably
probably one of the people most known about as kind of a lobbyist. You've been talking to people on the inside. What kind of attitudes are you encountering in the work you do at the moment on the inside of the government and Parliament?
Well, I mean, I'm talking mainly to people in Parliament who are supportive of trans people, and there's a lot of desperation, there's a lot of confusion, but there's a lot of determination as well. So I think there is much more support in Parliament and within government, in the civil service, for trans people's rights than there is for the people who are promoting conversion practices or trying to restrict medical care and things like that. It's just that they're very loud and they've managed to get themselves into a few places. We haven't been loud, and we need to start getting ourselves into places. And I think part of the reason I'm here today is because it's time to be loud. And my goodness, what a blooming great big demonstration. What, over 3,000 people at one point? I mean, I think that's the biggest demonstration. Is that a count you did? No, I think Peter Tatchell announced the numbers, but it certainly looked to me that there was definitely more than 2,000 at one point.
Yeah, I would have guessed about 3,000 myself.
And but you know, so makes it the biggest trans rights protest that I can remember in this country.
Yeah, this is the biggest I've seen that isn't a pride, that's for sure.
And who wouldn't want to be a part of that? I mean, the atmosphere, people were shook, people were angry, rightly so. People were scared, and I can understand that. But people were very supportive of each other, and while some of the language was a bit fruity, how many events have there actually been in a crowd of that size? Hardly any.
How hopeful are you that there's going to be a change in any number of the areas that you've mentioned, specifically CT, conversion therapy stuff, but also in the broader term? Do you think there's going to be a change anytime soon for the better for trans people?
Do you know, honestly, absolutely. And it's not trying to be the ever hopeful optimist. We saw with the government's Unsafe to Be Me conference just how many organisations banded together to show their solidarity and their support with the trans community. Over 150 at the last count. And we haven't seen unity and solidarity like that across the LGBTQ plus sector since Thatcher introduced Section 28. So because of that, I'm really hopeful and confident that, conversion practices will be banned, and that ban will include trans people, but also with the other things that I spoke about before. We can see that the general public is becoming more awakened and more knowledgeable about what this government is doing.
I'm not entirely optimistic, but I think that Johnson is very afraid of people power, and today it will definitely have helped put some steel into those Conservative MPs who we need to turn around to Johnson and say, no, you have to do much, much better by the trans communities, and that includes banning conversion practices.
Team Transactional, thank you so much for talking to me.
So where does all this leave us?
That's the million-dollar question.
Well, currently the government don't appear to be that interested in re-adding trans people to the ban, even though there was a YouGov poll that came out recently that showed the majority of people, including the majority of Conservatives, want to ban conversion therapy for trans people.
Yeah, there was a short article in, of all things, The Times about that.
Was this the Alicia Kearns article? Conservative MP writing in The Times saying that everybody owes trans people an apology.
Wow. Okay, so I completely missed that, but I mean, kind of see where she's coming from. But anyway, so you say everybody owes trans people an apology, and what you mean is your party and your friends probably owe trans people an apology, I think.
Yeah, say what you want about Alicia Kearns, and people will.
Yeah.
Good on her for that. That was pretty cool, in a way. Yeah, I was doing some digging as and when this was happening, which basically means I was calling up a lot of press office people and kind of being gaslighted by most of them. The impression I got from the various press officers I spoke to was that the Government Equalities Office, the people who were originally in charge of the ban and making it a thing, they work under Equalities Minister Liz Truss, had the ban snatched from them by Downing Street and were kept in the dark on what was planned. Like, they didn't know it was happening, and Number 10 took it off them and was just like, we're just going to put it in the bin. So when I was talking to people at the press office, they were like, no idea. Like, didn't know this was a thing this morning.
I see.
Now it's a thing. And this explains why mere hours before the whole screw job took place, Equalities Minister Mike Freer was promising on his social media accounts that trans people would be included in the ban. And then 4 hours later, it was like, that's not true anymore. So clearly no one told Mike Freer. And no one told Liz Truss. Boris Johnson just walked in and was like, I'll take that. And didn't tell anyone that he was going to fuck everyone. So I think there was a lot of very, very heated debate behind closed doors about that. But then there's also the backlash inside the larger parliamentary Conservative Party. As a result, as there's been reported in various places, that 50 Tory MPs are also demanding that we are put back in the ban. A Parliament petition demanding that we are put back in the ban also appeared online, and within 4 days of that, it had reached over 100,000 signatures, ensuring that it will be debated in Parliament at a later date. Finally, more protests are being planned, and since recording, there will have been protests against the removal of trans people from the ban in London, Manchester, Plymouth, and Brighton. There are more protests planned this week, including on Tuesday the 19th of April at Bond Square in Oxford, and on Cookridge Street in Leeds, on Saturday the 23rd of April at Derby Square in Liverpool. Please check in the description for more details on those so you can go along. And so the fight goes on. Ashleigh, how are you feeling after the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, quite. There's a lot, isn't there? It's kind of a lot to deal with, and to kind of have this sort of bone-deep feeling that the government just hates you. And that's no fun, really, because, and I'm sure they'd say, oh, of course, no, I don't hate trans people. But, also wouldn't really be that bothered if we all just disappeared. So I wish I could say this was surprising, but I remember, so I think you and I had a conversation, and I've had a similar-ish conversation with a couple of people, whereby when it's been theorised in the past, well, this is what the government might be working towards. We need to prepare ourselves for the government saying, oh, well, we'll do the ban, but we'll exclude trans people from it. Oh, no, don't be silly. They won't do that. Yeah, but they might, though. No, but they won't. Stop being so alarmist. Stop worrying. And now here we are in a situation where that's happened. And it won't stop here. Is the problem. Because if they can get away with this, they will start restricting things even more for all sorts of other marginalised groups. Anybody that doesn't directly correspond to who the Tories think Britain should be populated by, anybody that doesn't correspond to their narrow, ancient ideas, will be at risk. At risk of what? Don't know yet, but, this is ridiculous. And in tandem with the EHRC quote-unquote guidance that came out, this really does seem like an escalation, a stepping up of a campaign against trans people by the government and the press. And it may be that it's not a coordinated thing, but if so, gosh, isn't it such a coincidence that all of this stuff is just happening right now?
Yeah, it's almost to the day that everyone's bills went up that this started, which is an astonishing coincidence. I was surprised only by how this came about, not as the result of the consultation on the issue, because they released the consultation asking people to fill it in. They extended the deadline after notable GC people made complaints about the length of the consultation, so they extended it for them. And I was thinking, here's what's going to happen. They're going to get the results of the consultation and decide to leave trans people out because of some things they got sent, and that'll be what they use. For it to have not needed the consultation, for that to happen was a surprise.
Yeah.
But I think what people may not be totally aware of is how the larger GC lobbyists are very much on the side of... They will say that they're not on the side of conversion therapy, that they find it to be an abhorrent practice, but what they want is exploratory therapy, which is different from conversion therapy because they say so.
It's totally different, you guys.
Yeah. It's not the same thing, but I think it is. Of course it is. But then you have these wonderful terms like exploratory therapy that covers it up. And so people are assuming they're taking that at face value. And it's clearly worked. Because all the same lines that we've been hearing for years from GC people being like, oh, but what about it may end up with clinicians being on the wrong side of the law if they want to explore someone's gender identity, as if exploring someone's gender identity was not something that doesn't already happen in therapy when somebody's there saying, hey, I think I might be trans. So I think a kind of a lie has won out the day. And the problem is I'm going to play now Because I gave a speech at that protest.
Indeedy.
On Sunday, which is something I don't usually do, but I've been listening to a lot of stories lately, and, well, here's what I had to say.
My name's Michelle Starr. I'm not a survivor, but I'm a journalist for an outlet called What the Trans that I make in my bedroom with some friends of mine. So I've been working on telling the stories of CT survivors on and off for the past year. I have heard so many stories, and I want to paint how people get there, which is something people don't talk about. For 6 years, the UK has been experiencing a moral panic against trans people. That means 6 years of anti-trans crap is floating around on Google every day. A parent is come out to. That parent Googles trans kid. What do they find? Shit! They find children are being sacrificed for the trans lobby by Janice Turner. That's the big one. That is the front. And many articles like it are the front door to groups like the Bayswater Group and many others, which are hate holes run by gender-critical wankers. Gender-critical feminism is an abuse culture. I have seen the spaces where they are recommended specific clinicians. Some of you will know some of their names. The mainstream media is a front door to conversion therapy as an industry, and that is an industry that this government is protecting. They call it exploratory therapy, but it isn't. It isn't. And the press are culpable. People who are culpable for this are here today, and I have a message for you. Shut up! That's it, I went over my time, thank you. I don't do this, I'm a reporter. Right. Are you a survivor? Are you on the phone call? Come speak to me, come find me, thank you.
It's something that I have been screaming
Yeah.
for years, that very specific thing. Ashley, I'm sure that you're sick to the back teeth of hearing it, but it's true.
Well, that's the thing. It's true, and it always has been. So it's been a bit difficult for me to be totally dismissive of it. But it kind of sucks being right, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does in this case. But yeah, I guess the thing is that this is a system that is being protected, I really think. Because they're saying all these lines about exploratory therapy and how we must not, screw over clinicians with unintended consequences. But the truth of it is that's all nonsense. It's like, it's a racket.
Yeah.
The press profits off selling the idea that trans people are a cult that are capturing children. And that line works for the people that want to do this quote-unquote exploratory therapy, which results in people being damaged considerably.
Irreparable harm.
Yeah. So, that's fun.
Yes, what a delightful news segment this has turned out to be.
I'm so glad that I could be here to bum you out.
Yeah.
Ashley, that is my main job in life.
So, the thing is, the one thing that's giving me a certain amount of optimism at the moment is that this government has, U-turned and flip-flopped more than a fish on the deck of a boat. It's like, perhaps we can change things, because they do so often change their mind about things, or put out contradictory statements within a sort of a couple of days of each other. So you never know, maybe they'll roll this one back just like they have with so many other promises they've made, because, that might as well be the moral of the Conservative Party, really. Don't listen to our promises, the cruelty is the point. No doubt we shall return to this subject as time goes on.
Oh yeah, we will. I'll be doing a lot of work on this subject.
We are indeed.
You will hear the results of that, I'm sure, soon enough.
We're coming at things a little bit differently now, and we have a couple of things that we're working on in the background, which we will be talking about in a considerable amount of depth at a later time. So won't that be fun for everybody? But yeah, I think that's it on the news for today, isn't it?
Yeah, and for the meat of this episode, have something special. Ashley went and had a chat with someone who's very interesting, who we've had on before.
Indeedy. So you may remember from a few episodes ago, Felix Moore, who has written for The Observer and is basically, they're a historian, and recently had an article published about British trans icon, really, April Ashleigh, who sadly died in December of last year. So I sat down and had a chat with Felix about April's life, and I found out a few things. I was aware of the story. It's a bit difficult to be a trans person in the journalistic space, or even just on social media, really, and not hear of April Ashleigh. But there's some details here in this interview with Felix that he's managed to obtain that are fascinating, really interesting stuff. And this was great. I had a lovely chat with Felix. I'll stop wittering about it now, and I will play the tape. I am joined now, delightfully, by Felix Moore. Welcome to the show, Felix.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be back.
Indeed. Pleasure to have you again, of course. How have you been?
Yeah, I've been very well, thanks. Yeah, how have you been?
Oh, up and down.
Yeah.
As well, there's lots of stuff going on, isn't there?
There most certainly is.
But that is not what we're here to talk about.
Mercifully, no.
As you know, dear listener, we have occasionally dipped into some delightful bits of history on this podcast, and that's something I personally am very keen to do a little bit more of. So we thought we would get Felix along to join us and have a little bit of a chat about the sadly departed icon of the UK trans community, April Ashleigh, who, of course, died in December of 2021, December last year, just a few months ago as we record this. And I think this is somebody who, well, she had quite a life, didn't she?
Yeah, it was a real journey in many, many ways.
So before we get on to the actual details of April's life, can I just ask you real quick, what drew you to this woman, this story, this research?
Well, I did kind of start out more interested in the case that kind of was central to her life. Like that was what kind of really stuck out to me. As I researched it, I feel like I got to know her as a person a lot better, and I do think she was a really fascinating person. But I had a very basic understanding of the case and its consequences, which the more I researched it, turned out to be actually even more dramatic than I thought they were, because when I first started researching it, my understanding of the case was basically like, so before Corbett versus Corbett, which was the case that was what she was part of, before that case in 1971, trans people could change their legal sex, and then as a result of that case, they couldn't. And that is true, but it's not even the full truth. And the full truth is closer to, and I should say that I am not a lawyer or a legal expert, so my understanding of the legal principles involved may not be complete. But basically, legal sex as a concept in law didn't really exist before Corbett versus Corbett at all. And then arguably, Corbett versus Corbett brought it into existence. Although even then it didn't really do so in any official, on paper way. And that happened despite the fact that that was not the intention of, it certainly wasn't the intention of April. It wasn't the intention of her ex-husband, Arthur Corbett. And it also was expressly not the intention of the judge, who said in his judgment that he was not interested in defining legal sex. And despite that, his judgment basically became used as a de facto definition for legal sex for the next 34 years until the passage of the Gender Recognition Act in the UK, and also in cases across the world. I found at least 7 countries that had legal cases that in some way cited the Corbett decision.
So I think this may be a story that our listeners will be familiar with, but just for the benefit of those who aren't, let's go back to the beginning, can we? So, who is April Ashleigh, Felix? Tell us about her.
I'm going to sound like a Wikipedia entry. So she was born into a very poor family in Liverpool in 1935, I want to say. And she transitioned kind of slowly, starting in her late teens. I think she worked for several years at this very famous cabaret in Paris called Le Carrousel, which was kind of billed as a female impersonators cabaret and sort of burlesque show. The people who worked there kind of varied. So some of them were trans women, and some of them were not. The distinctions were very blurred at the time. But through working at that cabaret through the 50s, that was how she raised the money to go and get gender affirming surgery in Morocco in 1960, which sounds weird and unusual, but actually Morocco and specifically Casablanca was a very common destination for trans women to get bottom surgery in the mid 20th century. A lot of trans women, Jan Morris also got bottom surgery in Casablanca, I think even by the same surgeon. Okay. It was really just this one guy, Dr. Barreau. Barreau, he's French. I'm not sure if I'm probably not pronouncing that right.
Le Docteur
Georges Barreau. But yeah, so she had surgery. Then she basically started a career in modeling and a little bit in acting, but like her career was cut short because she was outed by a tabloid. Oh God, which one was it? I think it was Sunday People in 1961. In the early 60s, and that pretty much put a significant damper on her modeling career. She was edited, so she had gotten this very small part in a film starring Bing Crosby and Bob Hope.
Bob Hope, yeah. The Road to King Kong.
Yes, she got a small part in this film called The Road to Hong Kong with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. And then she was outed. She never found out who did it. Someone sold her story at the tabloids. Yeah, she was edited out of the film, I believe, and her name was removed from the credits. And subsequently, she had a very difficult time getting modeling work. But where the court case comes in is that in the early 60s, I think while she was working at the Carousel, she was introduced to the Honourable Arthur Corbett,
right,
who was the son of the Baron Roallan, who was at the time governor of Tasmania.
Wow.
So there's already like a major disparity here, because she was like from what described in her autobiography as a Dockland slum of Liverpool. And she would also describe how her family would keep their coal in the bathtub to stop it from being stolen.
Right.
She was introduced to the Honourable Arthur Corbett, son of Baron Roallan and future Baron himself. And he was pretty much obsessed with her immediately. What's really interesting about this, actually, and what I find really fascinating about him, is that he was married at the time with 4 children. Right. And he had a years-long history of, I guess, what you would call transvestism. He felt a very strong compulsion to cross-dress, and that was a big part of why he was so obsessed with April from the beginning.
So I'd read a little bit, well, more than a little bit really, about Corbett v. Corbett, about April Ashleigh's early life. I don't remember having come across that little tidbit of information before.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's really odd, and it also kind of underlines the sheer hypocrisy of the case.
Yes.
Because, jumping ahead a little bit, they were married in Gibraltar in the early 60s. I forget the year, but they're married. They'd been sort of courting for a couple of years, or sort of dating. Their relationship was pretty one-sided per April's account. So obviously I only have her side of the story, but per her account, he was a lot more into her than she was into him. She tried to break off their relationship and break off the engagement, she said, many times. And told him that she didn't love him. And he said, oh, that's all right, darling. I love you enough for the both of us. That sort of nonsense.
Wow.
Yeah. He was also a lot older than her. Yeah, but he was very explicit about the fact that he was attracted to her in large part because he saw her transition as kind of the fulfillment of his fantasy. The way he described it was the reality about her appearance was the reality was far greater than my fantasy. So his logic seems to have been that whenever he cross-dressed, he felt that he wasn't living up to his fantasy. He wasn't satisfied with how he looked. But when he saw April, he was this is the ultimate realization of my fantasy. So it's already a really gross and kind of dehumanizing way that he was viewing her, because he wasn't really seeing her as a person, I don't think.
It sounds proprietary, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was, and he was very proprietary, jealous as well. But he also was convinced that marrying April would cure him of the urge to cross-dress.
Oh, for goodness sake. Right.
Which it did, obviously.
Yeah.
It was kind of this weird psychological thing where he was well, if I can't transition, and I don't know if he wanted to medically transition, but if I can't fulfill my fantasy of cross-dressing, then the next best thing is to marry this woman who I view as the ultimate ideal of that. And actually, before he divorced his first wife, she seems to have been a pretty open-minded and chill woman by the standards of the aristocracy in the 60s, because he was quote unquote friends with April, and she was kind of his first wife, Eleanor, was kind of okay, well, you've got these this urge to cross-dress, and if you can work that out by being friends with this trans woman, then that's fine. And April met his first wife, she met his children, it seems to have been a really weird and awkward situation.
Yeah.
I mean, again, all of this is from April's perspective. So I have read, she wrote 2 autobiographies, one in the 80s and one in the early 2000s. I could only get hold of the second one because they're both out of print. But so I've only read that second autobiography of hers. So I don't have anyone else's side of the story. But yeah, she described like meeting his kids and stuff. Anyway, yeah, so surprisingly, being friends with her didn't cure him of the urge to cross-dress, and marrying her also didn't cure that. And she describes in her autobiography how she describes him as kind of like being 2 people. And she says that basically he would be like normal Arthur, and then he would suddenly switch into this like feminine persona who April referred to as she who must be obeyed. And he would take on this like feminine voice and basically just like castigate her and heap verbal abuse on her and say that she was, you know, like a slut and she'd been sleeping with all of these men and blah, blah, blah. And then he would just like snap out of it again. So really odd.
That is odd.
So obviously there was some stuff going on with him. The way that he chose to deal with that stuff was by pretty much using April. And then their marriage did not last very long. They only lived together for, I think, about 2 weeks at most. And then they basically like, they were still married, but they stopped living together, and they remained married for like several years, technically, while not living together or like being married, like in effect. And then eventually in 1966, April was in a really bad financial situation because her modeling career had dried up and she was having a really hard time supporting herself. So she, I think not unreasonably, was like, well, surely my technically still husband, who is a future baron, could like help me out a bit. And there was also, he had this villa in Spain, which he had told her prior to their marriage, like was going to be hers, although she had never actually seen any documents that had her name on them. So she basically requested that he pay her maintenance and requested the deeds to the property, I think. And his response to that was basically to say that their marriage had never been valid because she was, quote unquote, a man at the time of the marriage. And he wanted the marriage annulled on that basis. April also wanted the marriage annulled, but not on that basis, obviously. So this, I didn't quite have time to get into this in the article, but there were technically 2 grounds on which he asked for the annulment. The first was that she was, quote unquote, a man at the time of the marriage. And the second was that was due to, I think the legal phrase is incapacity or willful refusal to consummate. So basically he argued that because a marriage could only be legally consummated by like penis in vagina sex, she couldn't consummate the marriage because she didn't have a natal vagina. She did have a vagina, she had had the surgery, but his argument, which the judge ended up agreeing with, was that that didn't count, basically.
Moving the goalposts. So I think there's a lot to take in from there. There's several things within that I was not aware of, such as Mr. Corbett's propensity for a certain type of food.
I'm always like a bit of a loss to know how exactly to talk about him. I don't want to get all like good transition has saved her, but
I'm quite sure that people listening back to that section will be thinking in their heads, oh right, so egg then, which is obviously incredibly screwed up and also immensely privileged egg, who like chose to like channel his whatever gender stuff was going on for him into basically just exploiting another person as like a human fantasy and then discarding her when it was no longer convenient. I mean, one of the things that I find so hypocritical, is that the whole reason that he married her, like I don't think he would have married her, and I certainly don't think he would have left his first wife and 4 children for her if she had been a cis woman. Like the entire basis for his attraction to her was that she was trans. And then when he didn't want to pay her and their relationship had ended, he basically turned around and was like, our marriage was no longer valid for the exact reason that I entered into it into the first place. We think of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, you know, because like they had to go to all of this trouble to get married, of like getting a special dispensation from the Pope and everything because she was his brother's widow. And then they were married for like 20 years or whatever. And then he was like, when he didn't want to be married to her anymore, he was like, you know, I've just realized that it's incredibly theologically wrong for me to be married to my brother's widow and my soul is in danger. Like it's the exact same thing, really. And April's lawyers actually did try to call bullshit, basically. There's a principle called,
again, I'm not a lawyer. I think it's called estoppel.
Rings a bell.
Anyway, basically, it means that you shouldn't be able to get out of something based on information that you knew already. So, like in this case, you shouldn't be able to annul a marriage based on information that you were fully aware of at the time of the marriage. And they tried to get the case dismissed because of that. It didn't work for reasons that I can't fully remember. Like, I have read the entire judgment, but it was 30 pages of legalese.
30 pages of 1960s legalese. Not really very trans-friendly language back then.
But yeah, the naked hypocrisy just kind of stood. And I also think that there was a major class element.
Yes.
Which April's lawyers also thought and said, because, you know, Corbett was a future baron and April was a working class trans woman who came from Liverpool and grew up like keeping her coal in the bathtub, and she had risen to like marry into the peerage. And the judge Ormrod, like, you know, also came from a background that was, in my limited knowledge of him, definitely closer to Corbett's than April's. And regardless, would I think have been, you know, most judges at the time were pretty deferential, or arguably still are pretty deferential to the aristocracy. So I don't know how the verdict would have gone if they had been from like equivalent caste backgrounds, but it's very possible that it would have gone differently, because similar cases did in fact go very differently in other countries.
Since we started doing this podcast and doing all the media stuff I guess I used to do, I've looked at the history of trans and LGBT rights generally in the UK extensively, but I have to say I'm not 100% familiar with the history from within other countries. Obviously the current status of this or that state in America is something that you can look up, kind of thing. But so when you say that these are the cases from other countries, could you give us an example?
Yeah, so one of the things that was really dramatic about Corbett's legacy was that it did have this kind of knock-on effect, not only like across the UK and the way that trans people were treated legally in the UK across the board, but also in like a lot of other countries as well. Like most of them Commonwealth countries, which I think is fairly common for like British law to essentially be like adopted.
Yeah.
So like a lot of the cases that I read about were from Australia, for example.
Okay.
But there were also cases in like South Africa, New Zealand. The latest case that I found that cited Corbett, although didn't end up going with its conclusions, was in Hong Kong in 2013, which was the case that ultimately basically allowed some trans people in Hong Kong to like have their birth certificates changed.
Right.
So the Corbett judgment basically wasn't challenged, or at least like none of the cases that used it in the UK went in a different direction, basically up until the early 2000s, when the Gender Recognition Act was basically passed in order to ameliorate this issue. But what I thought was really interesting was that cases in other countries that cited Corbett started going against it within a few years. Right. In America, in New Jersey in 1976, there was this case that had a very similar outline to Corbett. So it was a trans woman and a cis man who had been married, and they'd separated, and the trans woman had requested that he pay alimony, and he had turned around and said, oh, well, our marriage wasn't valid because she's a man, meh, meh. Even though I'm pretty sure he paid for part of her transition. It's honestly depressing how many cases I found that follow that exact same outline.
Right.
Like at least 3. But in that case, the judge actually went in the opposite direction and said that the marriage was valid. It was definitely not a progressive judgment. He basically argued that in order to fulfill the role of wife, somebody needed to be able to engage in penetrative sex, vaginal sex. And given that this trans woman had had bottom surgery, that meant that she could fill that role. So obviously that judgment, like A, excludes like trans people who haven't had surgery, B, is extremely misogynistic and reductive, etc. Yeah. It was still a significant improvement on Corbett, because in the Corbett judgment, Justice Ormrod basically said that, yeah, sex involving April's vagina did not count as vaginal sex. He had wrote this really nasty thing where he said, I'm paraphrasing, but in my view, the distinction between sex using it and anal or intercrural sex is to be measured in inches.
What a nice fellow.
And this is despite the fact that there was actually legal precedent in the UK that a constructed vagina could be used to consummate a marriage, because there was this case from a few years earlier involving a cis woman who, I don't know exactly, she might have had some sort of intersex condition, but basically she was born with a vaginal canal that was like too short for penetrative sex. And there was a legal case about whether she could consummate a marriage, and the judge ruled that yes, she could, because she basically expressed willingness to have surgery to lengthen her vaginal canal. And he also said that in his view, she would be able to legally consummate a marriage even if she was born with no vagina at all and had to have one constructed from scratch. So theoretically, that would mean that a fully surgically constructed vagina was possible, could be used to consummate a marriage. But Ormrod basically referenced that judgment and said that he didn't think it counted because it was a, quote, pseudo vagina constructed in a male. I don't know why a fully constructed vagina in a cis woman wouldn't also be a pseudo vagina. So that's baffling.
Well, there you go. Patriarchy gonna patriarch. I think, as I've said, I've known a few of these details of the case, but I think actually sitting down and considering, I think if I personally had to go to court and then read a judgment about myself that talked about parts of my biology as having been constructed and about how I've got a male body and stuff, would be an extremely unpleasant experience.
Yeah, well, April wrote about the whole experience as being like incredibly traumatic for her, particularly because like part of what her lawyers were arguing was that she had some sort of intersex condition, which wasn't really provable. And like it's possible that she may have done. Like she described herself as being very feminine as like a child and a teenager. Like she never grew facial hair. If you look there are some pre-transition pictures of her. She does look very, very feminine. But it's one of those things where like we can never know. And also certainly in the court of 1969/1970, they also couldn't have known. But what that meant was that huge amounts of the case were very focused on the very particular details of her body, and particularly her body before she had surgery, which at the time of the court case was a decade before. But she was interrogated about the exact size of like her genitals, like her pre-surgery genitals, whether she had ever had an erection, whether she had ever ejaculated. And this was in court. And she also had to undergo like many, many medical examinations, both to test like the claims about her being intersex, but also in relation to the consummation angle of the case.
I see.
Yeah, she had to undergo what they called the 3-finger test, delightfully, which is exactly what it sounds like, to determine if her vagina could accommodate, quote, a normal-sized penis. Whole thing unbelievably invasive and cruel and traumatizing. She had to stand there in court and be battered with questions about a penis and testicles that she hadn't had for a decade and that she did not want to think about having had ever. And all of this was, this was all in the press. I don't know if all of the gnarly details of the case were in the press at the time, but like the whole case was kind of a tabloid sensation.
Well, thank God we've gotten past that.
Yeah. Well, part of what I was saying in the piece that I wrote for Pink News on this was that while it's certainly not at the same level, like there is kind of a parallel between what happened to April and the way that you go about getting a gender recognition certificate now, because April's gender was essentially being put on trial in order to be like have a judgment passed down upon it by Justice Ormrod. When you get a gender recognition certificate, as I did a couple of years ago, like it basically involves putting your gender on trial for a bunch of strangers who you don't meet and never will meet. I have no idea who those people are, but I had to send them like hundreds of pages of information about my body and my past and, my medical history. And like, obviously it's not the same thing as being like literally put on trial, but there like is a sort of parallel there.
Oh, I agree. Don't get me started on the subject more broadly, but the fact this government are quite happy to stick with precisely that, a gender trial for every person that wants to change their birth certificate, is just, I would say shocking, but it's not shocking.
Should be shocking, isn't actually that shocking.
Isn't surprising, shall we say. So obviously there was this court case, which a lot of stuff since then, rightly or wrongly, has been cited in reference to and been held up as evidence for on all sides of what is definitely not a debate because trans people exist, God damn it. But obviously that wasn't the whole rest of her life. So what happened next?
Well, she had a period of like suffering pretty intense mental consequences of the case, which I think is understandable.
Yes.
There was initially going to be an appeal to the case, but basically she just couldn't bear to go through it all again. So the appeal was dropped, which is unfortunate, but like understandable. She was kind of like, I mean, she was basically a celebrity after the court case, and she was in a weird position because she couldn't really keep modeling because she was so notorious that she wasn't really able to get work, but she was very famous and people did want to like be seen with her. So she became sort of like a socialite for a bit. She opened a restaurant for a couple of years in London where I think, which was quite popular and successful. I think at least partly because people wanted to like come and, you know, she did have to kind of perform, you know, people would come so that they could like have photos taken with her. And it was quite a sort of like, I don't know, it does seem to be quite a sort of like objectifying thing.
Mustn't have been much fun.
No, I don't know quite as much about her later life. She did eventually move to the US and she actually did get married again because in the US it was possible at that time for trans people to get married. So she married a younger guy who was a lot hotter than Corbett. One of the things I find so galling about this is that April was like one of the most beautiful women to ever walk the earth, and Corbett looked like an old leather wallet that someone's left out in the sun.
Yeah.
So the fact that we lost all legal rights for 30 years for that man is really galling. So it's nice that her second husband, who I think was called Jeff, was an absolute smoke show.
Good. It's what she deserves.
It's what she deserved. Their marriage also ultimately didn't last, but I am glad that she got to get married. And have like a marriage that like lasted and was with someone she actually liked.
That's the important part, really, I think.
And then she moved eventually to like some like obscure rural British town in like the 80s and got a whippet, I think, called Laura. There's a great interview with her from the 80s where she just looks absolutely fantastic. She looks like your posh, glamorous godmother.
I didn't have one of those, but I get the idea.
Well, the sort of archetype of a posh, glamorous godmother.
That's what I'm hoping I can be for my nephew. I'm going to be the classic mad auntie.
Yeah, her autobiography ends with her getting her gender recognition certificate in like 2006, which was really obviously hugely important for her, but like really powerful in general, because if it wasn't for Corbett versus Corbett, like the Gender Recognition Act in the form that it exists, like essentially wouldn't have existed or wouldn't have needed to exist because Corbett more or less accidentally set this de facto definition of legal sex, which was never like even really made official. So arguably like Corbett didn't make legal sex a thing either. It just became a sort of thing that was handed from judge to judge as this sort of shared understanding, but was not like a sort of on paper concept. So arguably the only people who have a legal sex now is trans people who have GRCs. That's not to say that there aren't official ways of recording people's sex, because there was and are, like, you know, birth certificates and passports and whatever. But what I mean when I say there wasn't any such thing as legal sex is that there wasn't any one like overarching, this is what it has to be on all of them, and this thing determines what is going to be said on every other document. Because April had managed to have her passport changed to female in like the early 60s, and she couldn't have her birth certificate changed, or she wasn't able to get it changed. But yeah, she had some female documents, and Ormrod, the judge in Corbett, was completely fine with her having her sex changed on like her passport and some of her other documents. Like that didn't bother him. He really didn't care, because as he was very clear, he wasn't interested in defining like legal sex as an overarching concept. He was interested in determining what sex meant and what woman meant in the context of a marriage, and in a legal context where same-sex marriage was like not widely discussed or like even really acknowledged as a possibility. So he was interested in defining what does woman mean in the concept of a heterosexual marriage. He was not interested in defining what does woman mean or what does legal sex mean. He didn't view it as incongruous that April should be listed as a woman on her passport, but a man for the purposes of marriage. He really didn't care. And before Corbett, there were like, as far as I can make out, like there weren't really any official rules. There certainly wasn't any way of recording this is what your legal sex is. And in terms of like individual documents, it seems to have kind of been up to whoever was asking and whoever they were in front of. So there are numerous anecdotes and like bits of evidence of trans people and some like definite cases of trans people managing to get some of their documents changed. So, and the earliest of that I could find goes back to the 1940s. There was this trans man called Michael Dillon. He talks in his autobiography about how during the Second World War, he went to the labor exchange in order to get his female documents replaced with male documents.
I think I know this story, but go on.
Yeah, and he says that he went in there kind of on the defensive and ready to be laughed at, basically. And the clerk was just very blasé, like, oh yeah, we've had quite a few of these applications, and just rubber stamped it, which is fascinating detail. And then what I had to cut from the article, but then Dillon, because this was during the Second World War, as a result of having had his papers changed over, he then immediately got issued call-up papers automatically for the army.
Yep.
So he had to go along to this medical examination and explain to the doctor, like, this is what's going on. And the doctor was also incredibly blasé and was like, oh yeah, we've had to turn down quite a few people like you.
Quite a few. That's like...
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is, because there's so many people today who are convinced that trans people are new, and it's because of the internet, or it's because of smartphones, or whatever. And actually, there's these anecdotes from 60, 70 years ago where, well, here we are, you know.
In Dillon's case, yeah. There's also this amazing research I found by this researcher called Ma Hicks, who's an amazing historian. And basically, I'm not sure what their pronouns are, so I'm just going to say they. But what they found is that the Ministry of Pensions had like records of trans people writing to them to request their documents being changed, like I think definitely going back to like the 60s, possibly even the 50s. And what ended up happening was they developed like an unofficial procedure for legally, well, sort of sub-legally, I guess, but basically for changing people's documents. And because in law, the only legal justification for changing someone's birth certificate was if you could prove that there had been a quote unquote mistake made at birth. And by that, they mean a literal mistake in the sense of like, you know, this person has an intersex condition, or I don't know, the doctor wasn't paying attention, something like some physical mistake. That was the only, in law, that was the only reason you could change a birth certificate. So what they would do is they would essentially just like on paper say, oh yeah, whoops, a mistake was made, and just change the birth certificate. So that's, and change the documents. Sorry, I'm not 100% sure if it was the birth certificate that was changed, but change the documents based on that, which was kind of a way of dealing with trans people in a bureaucratic way without officially acknowledging that you were dealing with trans people on paper. And like with a lot of these pre-Corbett individual cases, I think a lot of it had to do with class. Like in terms of the procedure they used for determining whose application would be successful and whose wouldn't, it was based a lot on things like job, like people with white collar jobs were a lot more likely to be accepted. Also race, obviously, because it was, you know, like British bureaucracy in like the 60s.
Yep, sounds pretty racist to me.
Yeah, but like in a lot of these individual cases, like it really does, I really do think that people's class played like a really big role in how successful they are. Like Michael Dillon, for example, was the son of a baronet and would go on to be at the center of a controversy about whether or not he could inherit that baronetcy from his brother. So I think it is highly likely that he was as successful as he was in having some of his documents changed, in large part because of his class background. There's also a case that I had to cut from the article for space, but there was this trans man in the 50s called Ewan Forbes Sempill, who was also the son of a baronet.
Right. Surprising how often that seems to keep
really
happening.
Weird how often this comes up. There's so many baronetcies floating around in British trans history. I actually really want to write an article someday about the role of the peerage in British trans history, because it looms large. But he managed to get his birth certificate, which is unusual. He managed to get his birth certificate amended in the early 50s, I think in 1952 or 3. And then he was subsequently at the center of this court case that was basically about whether or not he could inherit the baronetcy, because his brother, who was the baronet, had died, and it was like he was next in line. And then one of his cousins, who I sense like smelled opportunity, basically popped up and said, no, you can't inherit this baronetcy because you're, you know, not a man. Therefore, I should inherit this baronetcy. And there was a court case, and Forbes won that court case.
Nice.
The records of the case, and I don't quite understand how this happened, but basically the records of the case were like sealed So it couldn't be used as precedent in Corbett because the information about the case didn't become public until the early 90s.
Right.
I don't fully know exactly what was going on there, but I suspect it had a lot to do with, I mean, the case basically came down to, once again, you and Forbes Semple's lawyers were arguing that he was intersex, which in the mid 20th century, and to a degree still now, there wasn't really any clear one way of saying this person is trans versus this person is intersex. Medical understanding of like intersex conditions and medical understanding of being trans were like not very well advanced. So the lines between intersex and trans people become very difficult. So in that case, I think it was effectively up to the judge to say, like, this person is intersex versus this person is quote unquote just trans. And this is just a hunch. I have not read that judgment in full, or actually, I don't think I've read any of it. I've read summaries of it. But the judge basically said, like, yeah, I think this guy is intersex, so he can inherit. And that was pretty much just a judgment call. And I suspect that he was like, well, I would rather that the person who is like closer to the baronetcy and there's therefore higher in class status, I think he chose to side, it's possible that he chose to side with him versus this like upstart cousin.
Yeah.
That is my sense. I want to stress that is just me guessing.
Yes. Yeah. That's a hot take. That's not a fact.
That is a hot take by me. But, you know, Forbes Semple managed to get his birth certificate changed, which relatively few trans people did. So, yeah, before Corbett, it was kind of like an unregulated, like, gender Wild West, essentially.
Yeah, a crapshoot.
Yeah, it was a total crapshoot. It was entirely up to who you were, like how much nerve you had, who you were asking. There weren't really any rules. There certainly wasn't like any such thing as like, here is like legal sex and it is a box that is ticked, because you know, there was this wide variety of people with differing levels of success in getting various documents changed. And then after Corbett, basically all the doors slammed shut. Very, very quickly after the judgment. It was kind of adopted into law in various ways to make it so that like places would basically officially say like, no, we don't recognize trans people, we go exclusively based on assigned sex, whereas previously they wouldn't have said publicly, we love trans people, come and get your gender changed. But if a trans person had approached them privately, again, it would have been a crapshoot. There was no set rules.
There was no rules, there was no guidance for it.
Yeah, and that's how we have ended up with the Gender Recognition Act, which is why I think it's so frustrating that we are so mired in this never-ending argument that has been going on for like the last 5 years, where people seem to treat legal sex as if it is this kind of like core, like really foundational principle of British law that is being challenged and that is being eroded and is being threatened, and it's just not.
It's not. It wasn't there before the 70s.
No, and it was basically invented by accident because one guy didn't want to pay his ex-wife. It's like the pettiest of motives.
Given that this whole idea of, you know, legal sex and gender recognition is such a concocted issue by the people that would argue against trans people, and I think it's been very interesting to have a conversation about where that came from in the first instance. So, Felix, thank you for sitting down with us today. It's been a lovely chat, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon. But yes, this has been very educational, even for me, so thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us.
If you're interested in reading more about trans history, you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Felix Moore Actor. That's Moore, Moore. And then I have just literally today set up a Medium account because surprisingly, it's quite hard to get stuff about trans history published in the British press. Really? Who would have thought? It took me like many months to get the April Ashley piece published. So I decided to publish some of my writing about trans history on Medium. I just put up, I guess you would call it like an essay today about what trans history like means and like why it's uniquely challenging and interesting to talk about. So if you want to check that out, it's my handle on Medium is the same as on Twitter. So it's Felix Moore Actor.
Fantastic. I did follow you on Twitter now, but I didn't realise you actually did a bit of acting. We should talk, but perhaps not now.
Yeah, well, that is what I spent most of my time doing. Like before the pandemic, I have focused more on writing for the last couple of years for like obvious reasons.
Yeah.
I wanted to keep my handle consistent.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And what we will do is we will put the article that you've referenced a couple of times here, we will put that in the description for this episode. So obviously, yes, thanks for joining us, Felix. Listeners, darlings.
It's been a delight.
Yeah, check them out. out, follow on the Twitters and the other social media, and on Medium, of course. That was the other thing that you just mentioned, and I forgot it. I'm sorry. But yeah, thank you very much. So that was my chat with Felix about April Ashleigh, who I wish I could have met. But you were telling me a story not that long ago about when you met April Ashleigh, didn't you?
I have, and did tell you that story. I did meet April Ashleigh one time.
Nice.
I was at the Pink News Awards at the Foreign Office many years ago.
Ah, yes.
I was not nominated for anything. I was there mostly dealing with people's coats. And then I saw April Ashleigh and was like, well, this is absurd. I shouldn't be in the same room as her. I walked up to her and said, hi, are you April Ashleigh? And she said, yes. And I immediately said, well, this is absurd. And she was like, why? And I was like, because I shouldn't be here in the same room as you at the Foreign Office. This wasn't the plan.
Oh, Michelle.
And she was very confused by that because she didn't have the context about how, I'm a weirdo from the north of England who had no business in being in the Foreign Office. So she was just looking thoroughly confused. Thank God for Rebecca Root, the actor,
yes,
who came up and was just like, hey, should we all get a picture together? And I was like, yes, please.
Yes.
Because that got me out of the weird, awkward hole. And then we all posed for a picture. It ended up on Facebook. And then I was like, nice to meet you, April. Nice to talk to you again, Rebecca. And then I walked off to have a panic attack in the toilet.
Classic.
Yeah.
The Foreign Office does that to people.
She was very, very kind to me, by the way, April Ashleigh. She was very kind to me in spite of the fact that I was clearly not right in the head at that particular moment. And can anyone blame me? I was in the same room as April Ashleigh at the Foreign Office.
Yeah.
It was all swanky. I should not have been there, but I was.
The imposter syndrome was strong.
It's not imposter syndrome if it's true. I was an imposter.
Okay, I am not having this conversation with you again.
Fair enough. But yeah, that was a cool chat. What was the thing that surprised you most?
So I don't know, it's a bit difficult to actually pick out one particular thing, because obviously April Ashleigh, we've all heard of her. And I think there were some parts of it that were like, oh, yeah, okay. And even if you don't know the story, you can kind of make an educated guess, because you can kind of figure out the experience, or at least try and speculate as to the experience of trans people from very different generations. I think there were quite a lot of things that really weren't surprising, like when Felix was talking about the court case, where April is just constantly being misgendered. And it didn't occur to me that would be the case, but of course it would. It's the 1960s, and we've got some aristocrat fuck wanting to get out of his responsibilities. So in that sense, it's really not surprising at all, but it's so degrading, isn't it, to kind of have to hear stories of people who've gone through stuff like that. I had a text from my doctors the other day which had my dead name on it, which is really weird because I've never been with this doctor's while they've had that name. So I don't really understand where they've got that from or why. And what the hell? And I just got really slightly upset and anxious just reading it written down, Never mind sitting in a courtroom for days and days and days and hearing it and about, people arguing against your existence. It must have been extremely difficult for her. And I'm glad things improved for her over the course of her life.
Yeah, and I mean, what a life. I don't know what it would have been like to have been like on the front pages and all of that back then, but I think it would be... I don't know if that would be better or worse than now. Like, if you have a moment in the sun now, it's over very quickly.
Yeah.
But with back then, there was 4 newspapers, 1 TV channel, and everyone read the same thing. So I think in a way more people would... she would have made more of a splash.
Yeah.
Then.
The media landscape was less fractured.
Yes, exactly. And also, it was... Well, it had millions of people looking at the same 3 or 4 things. So the chances are everyone knew who April Ashleigh was, whereas not everyone is going to know who, Paris Lees or Laverne Cox or, what's his name? Cher's son.
Yes.
Not everyone, not even me. Not everyone is going to know who these people are, whereas back then, it's hard to imagine that not everyone knew who April Ashleigh was, which must have been very strange. But yeah, click in the description to find all the things you can follow Felix on. He's always got something really cool cooking, and he's always digging into trans history in a very in-depth way. And I always find that trans history, the best cure for internalized transphobia ever, because you learn stories of people that came before you.
Yeah.
And that's always good.
I have found, actually, looking at some trans history, obviously some of it's depressing as hell, but some of it has been strangely uplifting, heartening, really. It's just okay, yeah, these, we've always existed, and there's dare I say it, a certain amount of validation from knowing that you're not making it up.
Yeah.
So thank you everybody for tuning in. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks.
So yeah, in the meantime, if you want to find more of us, you can find us on whatthetrans.com. You can find us on Twitter at What the Trans. You can find us on Facebook, /What the Trans. You can find us on Patreon, where you can give us money.
If you like.
If you want. If you don't want to, then don't. We're not going to hold a gun to your head. It's your money.
Yeah.
Patreon.com/What the Trans. Until then, we'll be back again in 2 weeks. And until then, have a safe time if you are protesting this screw job nonsense. And yeah, look after yourselves.
Speak to you all soon. Goodbye.
Bye. This episode of What the Trans was written and produced by Ashley Talbot and Michelle Snow.
Hey, that's us.
Yeah, that's us. And was edited by Ben Swithin, who is not us.
And just want to say a big old thank you, as ever, to the people who have signed up for our producer-level Patreon thing that we have. And those people are Amelia M. Blonsky,
Samantha,
Kira, the asexual turf buster, and her trusty sidekick Jiggly Jubs,
Candy Cox,
Zeph,
Fiona McDonald,
Torikuso H,
Murgatroyd,
Claire Renshaw,
Ontologically Unjust,
Floopeth and Dragon Biscuits,
Sophie Bradshaw,
Stevie Lang,
Stella,
Michaela Irish,
Cindergosa,
Rebecca Prentice,
Graham Mulholland,
Crazy Richard,
Dan Oblivion,
Georgina Young,
Ty Griffiths,
Florence Stanley,
Riley,
Helen
Mallory Moore,
Chrissy Jarvis,
A Hitchhiking Velociraptor is Coming,
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Sim,
Melody Nix,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn Mackay,
Nick Duffy,
CB Bailey,
Peter Kimball,
Rachelology,
Wen Witherup,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Atom James,
Vanessa Billington,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Patreon user,
Vic Kelly,
Emma Doyle,
Catherine,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Tuck,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Coomber,
Maddie Bell,
Karakan 12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nines,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean,
Lanos.
and Chris Hubley. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.